One of the illusions of the Brexit debate is the idea that staying in the European Union is a way of protecting liberal values. In the story some Remainers like to tell, the EU is an institution that leaves behind the narrow loyalties and prejudices of nationalism to build a Europe-wide form of government. The referendum decision to draw back from this enlightened future could only be a retrograde step. In voting to leave, a British majority showed that it was stuck in the past. Not all Remainers rely on this story. The referendum asked a question to which there can be more than one reasonable answer, and many voted to stay in the EU because they assessed the costs and complexities of leaving to be greater than the likely benefits. For a hard core of Remainers, however, this was not a pragmatic issue. To opt for Brexit was unthinkable, and once they'd recovered from the shock of realising that the unthinkable had happened, they determined to do all they could to reverse the decision. Britain represented the illiberal past and the EU a liberal future. This was a far-fetched view at the time of the referendum, and today it is plainly false. Illiberal forces are advancing across the European continent. Hard right governments have strengthened their hold on power in Poland and Hungary, while in Austria and Italy, parties with links to interwar fascism play a pivotal role in ruling coalitions. The Czech Republic, Slovakia and Slovenia all have powerful far-right parties that are in or close to entering government. At the other end of Europe, Sweden, Finland and Denmark are in the same position. But it's in Germany that the advance of the far-right is most striking. Only a few months ago, Remainers were pointing to the monumental solidity of Angela Merkel's Germany as damning evidence of the folly of Brexit. Led by this liberal icon, who had welcomed over 1 million migrants into the country, the most powerful European state seemed to be the embodiment of the vision of a continent no longer shaped by national identities and borders. Now that picture of the future has itself been consigned to the past. Merkel lingers on, but she's a spent force. Under electoral threat from the far-right Alternative for Germany party, she's decided to institute border controls to prevent any further influx of migrants. Whether these controls will be effective is unclear, but similar or more severe restrictions are likely to be imposed by other European countries. Austria, Italy, Hungary and Poland will act to block any inflows of migrants across their borders. The Schengen Agreement on freedom of movement, which the European Commission sees as one of the cornerstones of the EU and treats as a red line in Brexit negotiations, is collapsing. Merkel's decision to set up border controls is also unlikely to stem the advance of the far-right in Germany. Before the election last year, the then German Vice-Chancellor and Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel told Der Spiegel that if the AfD entered the Bundestag, Nazis would speak in the German parliament for the first time in 70 years. When the AfD did just that, all other German parties vowed they would refuse to work with them. But Merkel has survived the turmoil of the past months only because these parties fear the further advance of AfD that would almost certainly follow if she stepped down and triggered another election. It seems to me a pretty safe bet that some years from now Germany will follow Italy and admit the far right into government. Leavers are routinely abused for being unrealistic, and there may be some who have had an oversimple view of Britain's post-Brexit place in an unstable world. But to my mind, doctrinaire Remainers are far more unrealistic about the stability of the EU. Soon after the referendum, I argued on this programme that Brexit was not a singularly British upheaval, but only the first in a succession of electoral revolts that would break out across the continent. Because parties of the centre identified themselves with the European project, the danger was that these revolts would be led by the far right and the EU would be balkanised. This is now happening. Yet few Remainers seem to have noticed the illiberal and fragmented Europe that has come into being. Some may point to Emmanuel Macron as proof of a counter-trend, but Macron's fate is uncertain. It should not be forgotten that over a third of those who voted in the final round of the presidential elections last year opted for Marine Le Pen, despite the National Front leader reverting to her father's racist rhetoric in the closing weeks of the campaign. If Macron's unpopular economic policies fail to produce positive results soon, it will be the far right and maybe the far left, which is equally hostile to the EU, that will benefit. The French president may prove to be the last major national leader to embody the European project. Doctrinaire Remainers respond to the advance of the far right by demanding more Europe. In other words, a more determined move to a transnational European state. They dismiss the suggestion, I would say the fact, that it is this very project that has fueled the advance of anti-liberal forces across the continent. By attempting to remove immigration from the jurisdiction of national governments, the EU has left large numbers of people with the sense that they have no control over their lives. The result of pushing for a type of transnational government that most Europeans do not want has been the rise of the worst kinds of nationalism. That is why borders are reappearing throughout the EU. Of course, these Remainers will say this is an expression of popular racism. But if you call anyone who demands democratic control of immigration a racist, don't be surprised if many of them go on to elect real racists as their leaders. One of Italy's new leaders is calling for a register of Roma people. Europe has heard this sort of thing before, and we know where it can lead. For its most devoted disciples, there's nothing wrong with the European project. It simply hasn't yet been applied in a pure and consistent manner. But isn't this what every blinkered ideologue says about their cherished fantasy of a new world? There are still people who will tell you that the former Soviet Union only began to practice large-scale repression under Stalin, who distorted Lenin's original vision. Historical facts show this is not so. Mass arrests, systematic killing, and the Gulag all began under Lenin, but ideologues are not interested in facts. Preserving their illusions matters more to them than anything else. The indifference to facts of totalitarian ideologies is well known. What's new is a type of liberalism that has also immunized itself against facts. Liberals like to think they are empiricists. In other words, they learn from experience. But ideological Remainers have learnt nothing from the march of the far right across the European continent. No fact will ever dislodge their conviction that Europe represents freedom and progress, and Britain the reactionary past. No doubt Britain has many faults. A virulent new strain of anti-Semitism has emerged in politics, mostly on the far left. But we have nothing like the large far-right movements that exist in many European countries. Unlike some European states, Britain remains a functioning liberal democracy. Remainers who blather on about the dark forces of British nationalism should look across the Channel to Europe. At present, the upshot of Brexit is unclear. Some believe it may be derailed, even reversed. I think this is highly unlikely. Either some version of a compromise, like that which Theresa May proposed, will be accepted, or Britain will exit without a deal. But if Brexit is somehow overturned, it will be supremely ironic. Under the banner of a march to a more liberal future, Britain will blunder back into a rerun of a dark European past.